Jai Prabhuji. Hello, welcome to the Retroprogressive Yoga Institute. My name is Swami Omkarananda. I am a disciple of Prabhuji since 1997, and in these courses I am sharing my reflections on the book written by Prabhuji, Tantra, Liberation in the World. In this book, Prabhuji shares the wisdom of the Tantric revelation, and the purpose of these classes is to take different parts of the book, analyze them deeper, reflect upon them, apply critical thinking, and also see how it's relevant for me, for my search, and how can I be enriched by the path walked by the Tantrikas. This is the class number 5 in the second course we are doing about it. So if you didn't watch the previous classes, I warmly recommend to start there, and then we are building up the complex history of the Tantric revelation. Of course, the book has much more to give from what we are sharing here, so I really recommend to get a book to follow along these classes. So far in this course we are putting the Tantra into the context in which it appears. This will help us a lot to understand deeper the peculiarity of this revelation, what it came and why it was so influential till today. And we're really seeing lately a revival of this tradition and a lot of interest towards what it has to say. It was a revelation that it was in the peak of its development, and it was flourishing, and then the invasions of Islamic beliefs cut really this development in the Indian subcontinent, and now we're seeing more and more scholars getting interested in its principles, in its context, and more seekers really getting towards these practices and trying to benefit from the ladders that the Tantrikas give us to climb up the spiritual understandings. In the previous classes, we studied the differences between the Vedic and the Tantric revelation. We concluded that they are not contradictory, but they are two parallel revelations that put the emphasis in different aspects of the development, of the evolution of the human consciousness. From within the Tantric revelation, we see that there are two currents. One is the right-hand path, which doesn't contradict the principle of the Vedic revelation, and we have the left-hand path that is believed to be influenced by non-Vedic sources, and therefore it uses practices that they were not acceptable by the Vedic principles. What we are going to do in this class is to analyze further the relationship between the pre-tantric cults that we call the Ati-mārga and the tantric cults and the tantric currents that we call the Mantra-mārga. In future classes, we are going to understand the currents of the Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Shaktism. So let's get started. So let's recap what we studied in the previous classes. We learned that there were different types of Vedic cults, and one of them gained a lot of popularity, which is the cult to the god Rudra. With the time, there was a later development of the type of cult that we call the Puranic cult, that it was explained in the Puranas. And the god Rudra get to be identified with the supreme god Śaiva. This is how we see that the Śaiva tradition went and gained popularity in different parts of India. From within this Puranic cult, devotional cult of Shiva, we see the emergence of cults that they were ascetic cults, that we can call them pre-tantric because they are not tantric yet. This is what we are going to learn this class, but they were the origins of the tantric revelations. Those cults were the Ati-mārga, in which there were cults that were more from the right hand and from the left hand. The left hand path of the Ati-mārga It's believed to be influenced by non-Vedic, the worship of the shamanic cult of the goddess, and these cults took shamanic elements of the worship of the Devi and incorporated to their practices. So this is how we see that from these pre-tantric cults, we see the emergence of the new tradition that with time we can identify it as Mantra-mārga, or the path of the mantras. Now we see that from the pre-tantric Ati-mārga cults that were from the right hand, that worship Sadashiva, we see the emergence of a current within the Tantra that is called Saiddhāntika. Saiddhāntika is a right-hand path, Tantra path, and is in accordance with the established truth. This is what Saiddhāntika means. Means it doesn't challenge the principles that were worshipped so far. But from the left-hand Ati-mārga practices that worship Bhairava, we see the emergence of the non-saiddhāntika cults, and we call them the left-hand Kaula path, and we are going to study the differences between them in depth in the future courses. But in this class, we are going to compare the characteristics of the Ati-mārga and the Mantra-mārga. What were the qualities of the pre-tantric Śaiva Ati-mārga? Śaiva because they worship the god Shiva. Now, they emerged between the 2nd and the 5th century of the current era that we see the development of these cults. They were very ancient, as you see. Now, this Ati-mārga, the meaning of the name Ati-mārga is the supreme or direct path. And the reason that they call themselves this way is because they saw themselves as a further development that goes beyond religion. Meaning there is the religion that is an intermediate path that you need for that priests, or you need certain institution to develop. But in the Ati-mārga, those were the brave and solitary seekers that they took the spiritual life as a direct relationship with the divine, and they are going to experience this themselves, a direct experience. And they saw themselves as supreme because it's a direct path that allows liberation. The Śaiva Ati-mārga, they were an ascetic and devotional tradition of extreme penance. We are going to do a full course about these sects. So just to summarize, they were ascetics, means they were taking upon themselves a harsh life of sacrifice and penance and privation from worldly desires, and they emphasize the devotion, the connection with the divine through love and worship. How these sects appear? It's believed that from within the lay followers of Shiva, those who wanted to take their spiritual search one step further, they approached the Ati-mārga spiritual masters and they requested to be initiated in the different sects. The lay followers of Shiva, it was not required to get initiation. Whoever wanted to follow the path, it was open, but the Ati-mārga was closed only for those who went through the initiation. It's believed that the initiation was a very powerful ceremony that opened the direct and transcendental experience to the initiated, and there it can continue developing and going its way to become a different state of consciousness. The Ati-mārgins, they aspired for final liberation or moksha. This was the main quality of them. They believed that the Vedic worship, the Puranic worship can develop you and make you advance in your development, but it doesn't give you liberation. For liberation, you need to be in that and only in that, and they were ready to take this life of renunciation and just go for final liberation. They were very very, very serious seekers, that they made a very big impact, that from their choices, from their path, we see how all the spirituality of India was shaken by these extreme examples. But then with time, this Ati-mārga went through different transformation until it became what we call the Tantric revelation. Prabhuji writes about the Ati-mārga practice. Their sadhana was antinomian and anti-Brahmanical in nature. They practiced meditative absorption in the deity, live on cremation grounds, and consume impure substances such as meat and alcohol. In their eagerness to transcend social conditioning, they adopted external symbols and transgressive behavior rejected by society. They lived on alms and ate from cups made of human skulls. They worshipped the masculine aspect of Shiva in his ferocious Bhairava manifestation, which is associated with annihilation. So we see in these sects the different type of approach to the spiritual search. We see the influence of the shamanic cults of the goddess with all these mortuary elements, transgressive behavior, consumption of forbidden substances, extreme behavior in the social aspect, the deep observation of what are the chains that make me attached to this body and doesn't allow me to be aware of my transcendental nature, divine Bhairava nature. So they behave as Bhairava. Bhairava is a big story. I will not go into this class, but we will learn, I promise, to explain it in depth in the course that we will make on the Ati-mārga and the different cults of this stage. They wanted to become Shiva, to become one with Shiva. So for that, they needed to behave like Bhairava. Like Bhairava is the ferocious aspect of Shiva in order to unite with the deity. So they got inspired from the mythology of the deity and they behave as such. And Bhairava is known to be the god of the cremation grounds, of the fearful aspect. This worship of the divine, beautiful and benevolent aspect can give us punya, can give us good karma, good deeds, can lead us to elevated stages of development, but not to liberation. For liberation, we need to become one with the Shiva consciousness. And for that, we need to start facing the reality of our temporality. We are temporal in this body. We are facing death every step we go towards this. We don't want to face it. We don't want to accept it. We're terrified by that. But these brave souls, they embrace this. They live already in the crematorium. It's a matter of time. And time is an illusion. And they are like walking with all these mortuary elements on them, decorated with ashes from the death, eating from a skull to see how temporal we are, but not just for the sadism of it, but for the beauty of the eternity of who is the one who operates this dead body, who is this soul that is alive, that is aware, that is intelligent. This is what we are. That is our nature. Awareness, consciousness is what I really are, and everything else is a temporary aspect of myself, but not my true nature. So behind this, there was a very deep tradition, understanding, parampara, which means disciplic succession, that passed, and there were scriptures and there were practices explained. There were stages very defined that goes and become more extreme. Who can even think about going through this path? You need to understand the level of these seekers, that they were like really ready to give everything for liberation. So these were the fathers of the Tantric revelation. Now, why this is not considered a Tantric revelation. It really sounds very familiar with all the left-hand path, the Kaula path. So what were actually the differences that make them a pre-tantric stage and not Tantra itself? So let's analyze it. The Ati-mārga is a pre-tantric tradition. It was mainly an oral tradition. There were some scriptures that explained the practices of these cults, but the Mantra-mārga was a scriptural revelation based on the Agamas. So we see the Agamas as the Tantric revelation itself, as the beginning of this tradition. The Ati-mārga were limited to male ascetics. The first text of the Ati-mārga, it was really mainly Brahmins that they gave up their social status to go for liberation. And the Mantra-mārga, what characterized really the Tantric revelation, is this social change that opened the liberation and the spiritual practice to all the castes and classes, and also women. So the social change that we see in the Mantra-mārga tradition is what we call the Tantric revelation. The Ati-mārga required asceticism, but the Mantra-mārga would qualify it that open the possibility of liberation for householders, because it replaced the asceticism by the ritualism. And by doing this change, this is how it became so popular, because now also if you were committed to your worldly obligations, it doesn't mean that you cannot get liberated. You don't need to go and give up your position in the society, but practice the ritualism that was revealed by the Tantras. In the Ati-mārga, they rejected the worldly enjoyments. It was really a path of penance, a path of austerities. The Mantra-mārga, why so tantric? Because this new spirit of embracing bhoga, sense enjoyment, and mystical powers or siddhis, utilizing the power that the body has in order to elevate, instead of rejecting and fighting against our sensual attractions or sexual attractions. They notice that this energy, this alive energy, is the Shakti, and the Shakti can and want to unite with Shiva. So through the practices of the bodily enjoyment, we can reunite. This is Tantra per excellence. In the Ati-mārga, they were solitary seekers that wandered decorated with mortuary elements. In the Mantra-mārga, they practiced in communities of initiated, kaulas. So we see the big difference here. The kaula path, the kaula we say it's the left-hand path, they were a group of practitioners that united around the spiritual master who initiate them and guide them through these practices that often they were made in groups and in pairs, and through these kaulas is believed to be like the groups of the yoginis, the followers of the yoginis, that they empower the seekers with the spiritual gnosis, with the spiritual knowledge, when they were pleased with their worship. So this magical world of worship and shamanism and spirits, this is what we call the kaula. The Ati-mārga, they were worshippers of Shiva. In the Mantra-mārga, they were worshippers of Shiva and Shakti. Tantra is a feminine path, is the path of worshipping the Divine Mother. So this is why we see that although they were influenced by the Ati-mārgins, but only in the Mantra-mārga we can call this a Tantric revelation. In the Ati-mārga, purposely they engage in public unacceptable behavior. They believe that this is the way to overcome karma and get rid of their pride, and they embrace these behaviors, and they were looked upon like really rejected and crazy. In the Mantra-mārga, they do preserve some of these practices, but they did it in a private setup, not publicly. They didn't expose this type of practices. So we can see here just some of the differences why the Ati-mārga still cannot be considered Tantra, and how yet they were taking many of these elements into this new revelation. Scholars try to investigate what are the origins of this tantric revelation, from where it came. It came from Vaishnavism, because we find tantric elements in Vaishnavism. It came from Buddhism, that in parallel times we see how Tantra really changed a whole current of Buddhism. It came from the shamanic worship of the goddess, from where this revelation came. It's not easy to reconstruct, and there is no really consensus. I little present kind of a conclusion, but you need to know that this is a very active field of research, and things are getting developed and restructured. But there are some elements that show a very clear continuation of a tradition that we find only in the Ati-mārga. Elements that they are present in the Tantra, and they are only present in the Ati-mārga and not in any other tradition of India or of Buddhism. So that's why there is a really compelling evidence that probably this was the origins of the revelation. So that's why I want to present now what are the differences that show us that yes, it's a clear continuation. The Ati-mārga is the first monotheist sect of India, and they worship Bhairava, which tradition which continue into the Mantra-mārga. The Ati-mārgins, they included Brahma mantras in their practices, very central mantras that afterwards they will become the mantras of initiation of the Mantra-mārga. In both, we can find the internalization of ritual. Ritual in the Vedic times, it was an external event that required also a lot of material wealth to be able to make it, and also expertise of the priests. But we see in this both tradition that the ritual went and became something internal, that you can visualize yourself as the deity, and the visualization of yourself as a deity in which the ritual is offered to yourself, to the consciousness in you, we can see in both traditions. We can see how they explore the energy anatomy. We have the anatomy of the physical body, but then we have the whole layer of energy that operates the body. The modern medicine usually don't relate to this energy. It's take for granted that it's a biological process. But both traditions see that the prana, it's the one of the manifestation of the Shakti, and we can heal the body through learning its anatomy, and we can release our bonds to the body by working on our energy, and we need this energy to elevate. Both traditions saw the body as a microcosmos of the sacred universe. We see these seeds of this view in the beginning of the Ati-mārga, and of course the Mantra-mārga embraced this microcosmos view and develop all the tantric practices, such as the Kundalini practice, the pranic practices, and of course the view of how everything needs to be searched inwards. Both traditions use yoga and meditation as means of liberation. We see that they share a common cosmology. The Ati-mārga starts telling about the worlds of Rudras. Rudras are considered lower emanations of the Supreme Lord Shiva. And to elevate to the worlds of Rudra, to attain unity with Shiva, this was all the process of the initiation and the practices. We see in both antinomian and transgressive practices to transcend karma. This is very unique to both traditions, that actually instead of being submissive to the acceptable norms, to challenge them, to change, to transgress them, is what caused me to transcend karma. Why? Because the conditioning is what make me a slave of my karma. But in order to do one step towards going beyond my karma and getting free, liberated, so I need to start from breaking my conditioning, and that's why they engage in this type of practices. Both look to transcend the ego, the attachment to the body, and to overcome the fear of death. And this is the inspiration of many of their practices. Both embrace solitary meditation in cremation grounds. Of course, in the Mantra-mārga, it's more of the left-hand practice, but we know that it developed further into that stage. Both use visualization rituals like the Manasa Puja or the identification with the body of the deity. And of course, the development of deity and then yantra and then mantra. So to recap, we have the Vedic cult of Rudra. From within this Vedic cult of Rudra, we see the emergence of a very prominent Śaiva tradition, which is a Puranic devotional worship of Shiva as the Supreme Lord. From within this Puranic, we see the ascetics that choose a life of initiation, an esoteric cult that create this tradition of the Ati-mārga. And from within the Ati-mārga, later developments make like kind of a domestication of their very ascetic and extreme penance practices in order to open this path to all the householder, the different castes, not only men, also women can engage in this. And then we see the emergence of what we call the Tantric revelation. And we will name them the Mantra-mārga stage of the revelation. This Mantra-mārga, it's a whole name to a whole group of traditions, but in fact they also bifurcated in more peculiar and specialized traditions. So let's see how Prabhuji explains the later bifurcation of the Mantra-mārga tradition. Divisions of the Mantra-mārga. Mantra-mārga bifurcated into two main branches according to the aspect of Shiva that was worshipped: Saiddhāntika, or the followers of the established truth, and Non-saiddhāntika. The former mainly worshipped the benevolent Sadashiva, commonly represented by the Shiva Linga. The later venerated the ferocious Bhairava, or various configurations of goddesses, culminating in the female cults of Kali. As you can see, the Tantric revelation is complex. It's like a tree that goes and develops different branches and attitudes. So the Ati-mārga, it's not that the Ati-mārga disappeared and it became the Mantra-mārga. It was a tradition that continued in parallel, but from within this tradition, there were some influences that it created a new tradition that was the Tantric revelation with the Tantric agamas, and it became what we call now the Mantra-mārga. Now Prabhuji explains that this Mantra-mārga bifurcated earlier on into the right-hand Tantra path and the left-hand Kaula path. We see the influences of the Ati-mārga and the influence of the shamanic cults of the goddess. So Saiddhāntika is the current that follow the established truth, and Non-saiddhāntika is those who oppose by all their practices and worldview, they expose the Vedic attitude. The Saiddhāntika, they worship Sadashiva. It's a benevolent aspect of God, of the Supreme Shiva, and often is worshipped in the form of the Shiva Lingam. Their scriptures that they follow were the 28 Siddhanta scriptures, which are composed of the 10 Shiva Tantras and the 18 Rudra Tantras. We will do in the future a whole course about the different Tantric scriptures. The Non-saiddhāntika, the left-hand Kaula path, it divided. They were cults that they worship the deity Svachandra. Svachandra Shiva, which is Svachandra means independent. So it's more oriented to the male worship. And we have the female deity that culminates with the worship of Kali. This, the non-saiddhāntika left-hand Kaula path, was explained in the 64 Bhairava Tantras. So to recap, we have the Vedic cult of Rudra. From there, it developed the Puranic cult of Shiva. From there, the Ati-mārga sects. They continue their tradition, but they influence a new tradition, the Mantra-mārga, which divide in turn in the Saiddhāntika, which were very compatible with their previous. They coexist with all the Vedic and Puranic cults. They were not transgressing these principles, but we have the Mantra-mārga. The Mantra-mārga, we see the Svachandra, the aspect of the Mantra-pīṭha and the Vidyā-pīṭha. This was a further division, and this is how Prabhuji explains it. Divisions of the Non-saiddhāntika. The Non-saiddhāntika branch was divided into two types of lineages. Mantra-pīṭha, lineages that worshipped with the mantras of the male deities and taught the worship of Shiva in his Svachandra form. Vidyā-pīṭha are the lineages that worshipped with mantras of female deity and taught the worship of Shakti, the mother of the universe. So to put it in this graph for clarification, we see the tantric cults of the Mantra-mārga, as we said, divided in Saiddhāntika and Non-saiddhāntika. The Saiddhāntika developed the tradition of the Śaiva Siddhanta, that we will learn in depth in future classes. They worship Sadashiva or the Shiva Lingam, and the Non-saiddhāntika divided in turn in the Mantra-pīṭha and the Vidyā-pīṭha. The Vidyā-pīṭha also had a further division, and this is how Prabhuji explains it. The collection Vidyā-pīṭha Tantras is subdivided into Vama Tantras, the left Tantras, Yamala Tantras, the union Tantras, and Shakti Tantras, the energy Tantras. The Shakti Tantras include the Trika Tantras and the text related to the Kali cults. Let's put it in our graph for clarification and for recap. So from the Mantra-mārga, we have the Saiddhāntika and Non-saiddhāntika. The Saiddhāntika is the right path, and the Śaiva Siddhanta worship of the Sadashiva. The Non-saiddhāntika has the Mantra-pīṭha, which is kind of a middle path between the very right worship of Sadashiva and the female deity. We see some aspects of the female worship, but it's mainly male-oriented, and we will learn in depth the differences. The Vidyā-pīṭha further divided into three different types of worship, types of tantras. When I say tantras, I mean the agamas, the scriptures. The scriptures explain the worship, explain the principles of each branch. So we have the Vamachara, what we learn is the left hand, which worship the deities of Jaya, Vijaya, and Ajita, and the brother Tumbulu Bhairava. We will learn this in depth. I just mentioned this there. The Yamala Tantras. Yamala means union. It's the couple of Shiva and Shakti. The deities that they worship was Kapalisha Bhairava and Chanda Kapalini. Amazing and fascinating the tradition. And we have the very prominent Shakti Tantras, the worship of the female, that this is the most extreme Shaktism, and this was further developed in the goddess Trika and the goddess Kali. So we see a further division of the Shakti Tantras. To finalize this class, I want to bring the spirit in which Prabhuji explains to us all this complexity of the Tantra. To reconstruct Tantra's history, we have to draw on the clues not erased by time or by the awful destruction brought about by religiously intolerant conquerors. these foreigners could not appreciate the divine miracle that took place in ancient India. Instead, they thought that the images of erotic yoginis reflected a culture of exhibitionism and sin. They could not see that they had come not only to a distant land, but to a future time. They encountered a culture with such advanced moral and spiritual values that it would take years for the West to understand. You can feel here the amazement of this revelation. It was so ancient. Think about it, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century of the current era. It was a time in which the Indian society wanted more. They didn't want this ancient worship of the Vedas. They wanted progress. And in the progress, they wanted to incorporate the woman in the search. They wanted to change the social orders of discrimination. They wanted to see everybody as one in front of the God. Everyone is divine and can get liberated, no matter from which origin it comes. It was a step forward for a society. That's why Prabhuji said it's not only an ancient land, it's in future times. It's like how many centuries will take to the West to incorporate or to give place to some kind of sexual liberation, to unleash the power of the sexuality of the human being and use it in a positive way. We see the repression and we see the deformation that it causes to a society, the creativity that it brings, that it incorporates all its power. Society as a whole can push together for development. And we see the sad story of conflicts and destruction, that they come and destroy all this revelation. This revelation is practically lost. We are speaking about nostalgia. It was distracted. It was stopped. Like the temples were distracted. Scriptures were burnt, hardly survived. By miracle, we have some of these scriptures, but this conflict and this imposition of beliefs, different set of values, they couldn't appreciate that they were not worshippers of the devil or worshippers of sin, but worshippers of life as a whole, and to embrace the beauty that is manifested through the woman, that is the beauty of the divine life, the giving of life and the giving of creativity, of this amazing manifestation that is just a sacred universe in which everything is in ourself, in our consciousness. So it's really an amazing revelation that worthwhile to explore and to revive and to try to incorporate some of its spirit for our liberation. We are daughters and sons of this repressed society and unjust society. So the spirit of embracing, of not negating, on accepting everyone can be so beneficial for creating the right environment for the divine to express through us and show itself to us. So with this spirit, we will stop here and we will continue in the next class. Thank you very much. Jai Prabhuji.